So I, in this role that was just described, I wonder a lot, right? I wonder about the weather 10 years from now. I wonder about education. I wonder about illness. I wonder about whether or not my kids are prepared for the future, both outside and in. I wonder if I wore the right dress. I wonder if I talk too fast. That might be worry. I'm not sure if that's wonder. But I actually spend a lot of time formally thinking about these big shifts that are coming and helping prepare organizations and leaders of all types, not just understand it, but also understand what it expects of them and figure out if they've got the tools to navigate it. So that's what I'm going to take you guys through at the beginning here, sort of those three things, right? What is actually happening? What's it going to expect from each of us? And do we have the tools to be able to manage it moving forward? So we're going to have some slides that kind of flip through this as we go forward. There's about 9 shifts that we described that we feel as everyone should have at least a working knowledge of. We can have differences of opinions about how important those things are, but they are actually things that we need to somehow have some opinion on. So the first is a bipolar economy. We hear a lot about the fact that 20.9% currently in the United States control the wealth, 1% of the population controls 20.9% of the wealth. Now, what's even more startling is that since the recession, the Great Recession and the recovery that happened afterwards, that same 1% was able to accumulate 95% of what was recovered. 95. Now, we assume that, again, they lost a great portion of the wealth as well, but I don't think they lost all of it. So the fact that it keeps continuing to aggregate and get more and more polarized is an interesting phenomena. And it's not just in the US, it's also worldwide. Recently, Oxfam related a stat that 85 of the richest people in the world control the equivalent wealth of the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world. Now again, if you imagine that the poorest people in the world make $1 a day, we each would also have a significant amount of wealth, but not the same. I mean, again, that concentration and that polarization is kind of extraordinary, and it raises questions, right, about how did that happen, about if that's fair, and maybe should, or even could, it be redistributed in some other way. It also puts more pragmatically pressure on households, on businesses, on governments to kind of figure out now how to change their systems as a result of that. Whether or not it fixes or it doesn't fix itself, the fact is the world is different, right? We can't sell our products the same way. We can't necessarily think about the market as always having this really robust middle class. The next big shift then is the Internet of Everything, right? We hear about that a lot, but it really is kind of extraordinary to think that transistors will become so tiny and so cheap that they can be embedded in absolutely everything, right? From our lawn sprinklers, to our toothbrush, to our cereal boxes, to our pillows. I was actually having a debate with a futurist of Intel about the fact that he couldn't make my pillow any better than it is, and he convinced me that he could. Right? So if you imagine at some point it will be able to download what it is I've been dreaming about at night and somehow do some processing in the morning and tell me exactly what it is I'm most worried about or most excited about, I suppose they can make my pillow better. But those are the kinds of things that are possible, right? These things will become smart computers, and they will be able to literally gather data, process data, and spit it back at us in some pretty extraordinary ways. It makes life almost 100% quantified, right? And 100% optimized. Imagine that, right? So I start to think again about, like, what does that mean for privacy? What does that mean for ethics? And most of all, it makes me wonder about what will happen with the concept of surprise in a world that is algorithmically predictive. Right, in which we aren't actually making active choices. These things will often be actually made for us. How will that feel to be a human in a world that looks like that? The next big shift that I spend a lot of time thinking about is this radical shift in technology. The Internet of Everything is only one part of it, right? We're now moving into the land of 3D printers, robotics, bioengineering, the whole space economy, wearable technology. I mean, over and over again, we're being confronted by whole new ways of showing up, which then creates this mandate for constant disruption and constant change. Now, again, I spent a lot of time working with corporations and big CEOs who at one point, just a few years ago, asked me when this was going to stop. Like, Craig, when does it stop? They've now come to grips with the fact that it's not going to stop, right? This is going to be a constant state of which we're a part. But I don't think they've actually grokked yet that this means that we actually have to show up differently and prepare for a space of constant disruption. So the next thing that they're thinking about, and we're all thinking about together, is this place of permanent ambiguity. Doug Rushkoff describes it as present shock, right? When we're in a space in which everything that we thought was true might be changing, might be upended, might somehow be shifting right underneath our feet. Things that we thought we could predict and count on are no longer necessarily true. We are in a place of constant learning and relearning. What does that mean, and how do we hold that, right? It's a society of constant uncertainty and a permanent state of flux, or what I will call infinite living, right? Sort of the endless now. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine via text one day, and I still like to say hi, text for a little while, and say goodbye. He was in a spot of like, just start the conversation, somehow end the conversation. I'm not really sure if we're still in it or not. And I couldn't figure out the difference, and I realized I'm a narrative texter. I still believe in that old world. You're an infinite texter. For you, there's an constant, ongoing conversation. That is sort of the way society looks as well. Sometimes those two things don't necessarily fit well together. The next big shift that we spend time talking about, the good news is around this whole shift of infinite, right, is that we also then constantly have access to other people. We are not in this game alone anymore. I never have to spend time wondering if the snack that I'm having in the middle of the night, whether it's pickles and sour cream or whatever that might be, is a weird snack. I can always find somebody online who would offer an opinion about whether or not that was a good idea or not a bad idea. But the same happens if I'm trying to figure out how to price my products. Whether I'm a seller or whether I'm a buyer, is that a fair deal or is it not a fair deal? Is my government taking good care of me? Are they keeping me safe? Interesting question. It's a constant conversation, and we're often invited to be a part of it. Again, we could go on and on. Any of these shifts, by the way, we could talk about for an hour each. The thing I think is fascinating about this one is that it creates a social net, right? There's a fabric of which connects us all and gives us increased confidence to take risks, to do things that are different, to somehow move forward in a completely different way. Which is great, because we're in a moment right now where we are constantly being barraged by breakdowns in systems. Again, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, or whether it's this giant plastic ocean or wave that's a wave, plastic morass that's in the middle of the ocean, we need to somehow think through that, right, as a group. We can't just ignore that anymore. There's a documentary every week that will show us pictures. There's somebody online who's really passionate about that and calling it to our attention, and we're seeing the growing complexity of those problems. It also calls to question growth. Right? Is growth necessarily the strategy that we need to continue to follow? What is enough is part of the question. Which leads to this next interesting thing, which we're observing more and more, right? Is new structures are being created to coordinate action and to be able to share resources. Some call it the relationship economy, some call it the human age. But either way, they're built on this principle that we are somehow going to be more and more engaged and responsible and coordinated with each other. One of the people who I spend a lot of time with is this guy named Jerry Michalski in San Francisco. And he describes this question about trust. What would it look like if we redesigned all of our systems in trust? What would a school look like if we trusted kids with their own learning? What would work look like? What would patent law look like? What would corporations and their data sets look like, right? We're seeing more and more this call for data philanthropy. That's a term you guys have heard, but this idea of opening data and sharing it more. We're seeing more corporations decide that they need to invite customers and stakeholders into the process and co-create with them. We're also starting to see some of the largest corporations actually start to have conversations about how they can collaborate with each other on really audacious initiatives. Because as the problems get bigger or more complex, we realize we can't do this alone. Right? There's this wonderful opportunity to somehow do it together, and we're seeing completely radical new solutions. What's so fascinating about this one to me is that you see basically enthusiastic entrepreneurs suddenly become social architects, right? Airbnb, Uber, constantly changing things, but also co-living situations and this whole conversation about social flow in which we can measure that are all on the horizon. We are just at the tippy end of what we're about to see there. So that puts pressure then on current business models, right? We look at the things that currently exist and say, do they still hold up? Should we be looking at things from a different perspective? Certainly education has that scrutiny. Capitalism is certainly part of that conversation, right? Are the ways in which these systems set up still make sense in a place in which the power shifts away from institutions and corporations and more to empowered individuals? And not just individuals, but us as commons, the greater good, society, right? There will be different pressures that get put on these systems. And capitalism, again, is one where we sit there and say, is it okay to have, can we even still expect to grow our businesses with healthy margins when they have no contribution, when they have no mission of which they are a part? It's a question that many of the people, again, in my world, are wrestling through. Now, what's interesting about all this stuff when you think about them all together, right, is you start to see what the world can look like 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. And what you realize is that these things are not all separate. Now, again, I could have gone through a bunch of things that I didn't put on that list, right, when we start thinking about things that are shifting or changing. I think most of them become somehow related to these, because these things are not disconnected from one another, right? These are not isolated things that are all happening. They're all connected. And this idea of understanding connection is huge when we start to think about how we move forward and what it expects from us. So again, I sit back in my little spot and I wonder, right? Wonder what this means for us as leaders and creators. What is it that we are expected to deliver in a society that looks like that, and in a future that looks like that? My hypothesis is that radical ideas or radical solutions, right, require an openness to radical ideas. And what are some of those radical ideas? Well, just quickly again, I will go through and say in the business world, we've been taught that it's about consistency and control and autonomy and authority. Probably a list of more, but those are 4 really big ones, right? And I go in now and I share with them and say, actually, the world has changed. It's not about those things anymore. It's about being responsive. It's about being distributed in the way that we share information and that we share power within the organization. It's about humility and saying, I don't know. You try and tell CEOs that it's okay to say, I don't know. That scares the hell out of them. That is not what they've been taught makes them successful as a leader. And yet that's exactly the key that we need now for them to be able to walk in and say, I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to listen, right? So these places then to go, okay, this is how I'm supposed to show up. How do I actually get there, right? It's about helping them understand that living in a land of ambiguity is okay. Not always having the answer is fine. This idea that we can actually trust each other, that we can go into a space of expressing love and listening with empathy, right? Those are not easy concepts for a company to understand and for them to kind of work their way through. So we move into this whole question then again about as we move forward in this space together, how do we get to a place where we can open not just our heads, but open our hearts, right? There's a word that I learned to spend a lot of time with. It was a really important word for me. It's this word wonder, as you guys heard me describe it before. There was a guru in town who taught me this idea that wonder and resistance can't coexist. I was like, that's a great concept. And I spent some time really trying to understand that one. And now it has shown up in literally every corporate presentation I've done since. And they spent some time trying to understand what that means. And I think wonder is this incredible gateway drug. It allows us to go into a space in which we can put our heart into the game and put our brain aside a little bit, right? It allows us to kind of relax into this place of possibility. And then you're in a place of possibility, you actually then can open up to all kinds of new things, including this idea about self-awareness. We've heard that a lot today, but self-awareness is the critical tool, right? Again, as a leader or as a creator, you have to be able to understand where your boundaries are and how it is that you go. So in that place of self-awareness, it then opens up the door to what I would consider to be compassion. And compassion not just for others, but for yourself. It really does start here. Max talked about this idea of inside out, right? When you have compassion for yourself and you can see yourself in its full glory, it certainly gives you compassion for others, which then gives you a chance to actually think more about what the world needs and how you can be a part of the solution from which it goes. I think if you walk away from one, that would be my favorite. Now, how can I be so sure about this? I'll just tell you really quickly, because I know we're running behind in the day. But 5 years ago, my life kind of blew up. I will spare you all the messy details. I will say it did not have anything to do with health. It was some active choices that I made, but they were dramatic enough that they made me think about how I walk through the world, how I show up, what's important to me, what matters, how do I contribute, right? And it's a very messy process. Anybody who's gone through that kind of sense of self-awareness, self-transformation, personal growth can tell you that there are some really not great moments that are associated with it. But the craziest part is that I was going through that personally, and I'm looking up watching that my companies and clients that I work with were wrestling with the exact same things, right? Questions around authenticity and vulnerability, which we as individuals have, corporations and organizations and leaders are struggling with exactly the same thing. And the more that I could bring my completely flawed humanity to the work that they were doing, the more that I had compassion and empathy for where they are, the more I could guide them to more radical solutions and radical openings. That's extraordinarily good news. The interesting thing about all this stuff is that we are not doing this actually in isolation, right? So yes, I do think radical solutions need openness to radical ideas, which are born of a radical openness of heart, but we're doing it as part of a much bigger system. And that's a really comforting thing. We start to confront a really complex problem to know that it is related to much other things, right? And it's not just about mind and body and soul, which are critically important for us as individuals. We have portals of wisdom that come in from so many different places. We don't have to sit here and just figure it out just from one little place. There are amazing solutions that come in, as we've been hearing about all day. But it also happens, again, on a systems basis. It happens as a society, it happens as a corporation, it happens in many, many big ways. We start to appreciate that dark and light dance together, right? I finally come to grips with the fact that growth is only possible when suffering is also a part of the situation. I try to avoid suffering as much as possible. And I realized you kind of can't, right? Once you start to accept that those two things are in combination, it actually, again, opens up a space of possibility and creation. And we recognize that this invisible web, that somehow of which we are a part, is something that will hold us as we move forward. To me, that is an incredibly comforting place. One of the things I wondered out loud with my clients and with people who know me is what would it have been like to be standing at the front end of the Renaissance? Would we have known that we were there? Would I have known that you were thinking this and you were thinking that and you were thinking that, and collectively it was going to grow into something kind of extraordinary that changed society? I think we're in a moment that is actually that pivotal, right? I wonder if we recognize that we're standing there now. Thank you.